This is not merely our battle, it's the battle of the entire civilized world.
We won't leave. We won't leave.
As anticipation of an all-out ground assault continues, Israeli forces are ramping up their attacks on Gaza.
We will deepen our attacks to minimise the dangers to our forces in the next stages of the war. We are going to increase the attacks from today.
This means the humanitarian crisis is set to deepen, with warnings Gaza's healthcare system is already on the brink of collapse.
The health sector is about to fail. We have very limitation of medical equipment. Of course, no electricity available. We have here in the hospital more than 40,000 civilian people who come to the hospital seeking for some safety.
At the same time, Iran-backed Hezbollah has warned Israel that any invasion will lead to reprisals.
Do you believe that if you try to crush the Palestinian resistance, other resistance fighters in the region will not act?
This tension is being felt on the border with Lebanon, where airstrikes have residents on both sides fleeing. Meanwhile, support for Palestinians from afar, with 100,000 protesters taking to the streets of London, demanding an immediate ceasefire, humanitarian aid, and a free Palestine. The protests came as 20 trucks carrying much-needed aid finally made it through Gaza's border with Egypt. It's welcome aid, but nowhere near enough.
We need to have, instead of 20 trucks per day, at least 100, 200 trucks going in per day.
The border opening coming just hours after the release of 2 American hostages taken by Hamas. 59-year-old Judith Tyranen and her 17-year-old daughter, Natalie.
When I see her again, I think there aren't going to be words to express what's going on. I think it's just going to be this, intense hug that is bigger than words.
A rare piece of good news in a humanitarian crisis that looks set to escalate.
Joining us live from Tel Aviv is IDF spokesperson Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner. Lieutenant Colonel, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. How far off is the Israeli ground invasion?
Sure, Georgie, we are currently on day 16 of our offensive against Hamas in the immediate aftermath of the most brutal terrorist attack against our people in the history of our country. Now with over 1,300 people butchered, murdered, raped, assassinated. And we are still burying some 200 people a day, and there are still many people, victims that have not been identified. And of course, there are 210 people being held hostage by Hamas. The ground offensive, if and when it is launched, will be at the decision and instruction of the government. And we are taking the necessary steps to be prepared for that instruction if and when it comes. We've recruited some 300,000 reservists in order to be prepared for that mobilization. And we are currently gearing up, equipping them, training them, and I'd also say tasking them. So making sure that each and every unit has their specific tasks for if and when that instruction comes.
Lieutenant Colonel, thousands of Palestinians are dead already. How much is being done to limit civilian casualties?
Well, like in Australia and the Australian military, we operate based on 3 core components of distinction, military necessity, and proportionality in warfare. But the defining element of our operations is indeed to destroy Hamas. Obviously, the reality of operating in the Gaza Strip is an extremely challenging one with regard, and that's probably an understatement. It's very, very tough to try and differentiate between the civilian population and try and get them out of harm's way, and that is what we are trying to do. For instance, in the last week, we've been encouraging people to evacuate from northern Gaza, where Hamas has established its fortress of terror, so that people should shift towards the south in order to get them out of harm's way. Hamas on their side have tried to prevent that by intimidating people, telling them not to leave, and also erecting checkpoints, physically preventing people evacuating an area which is a potential strike zone. So I would say, yes, there is a huge challenge, and we are trying to limit the civilian stress and the civilian strife caused by this war, a war that we didn't choose, Hamas chose, but a war that we are determined to win.
When you look into the future for the region, do you see a permanent Israeli military presence in Gaza once this conflict is over?
So our government has been clear on that. We don't want to reoccupy Gaza. That is not the mission. The mission is to remove forever the threat of Hamas as a terrorist organization that governs the Gaza Strip as a staging ground against Israeli civilians, men, women, and children. That is our end goal. That is what the military is tasked with. Indeed, the Palestinians need to determine their destiny on the day after of what happens, but it cannot be a regime that utilizes the forces and the powers of government as a governing authority of the Gaza Strip in order to build a terrorist army, in order to instruct that terrorist army to strike at the soft underbelly of Israeli society, the farmers, the families, the doctors, the nurses, the teachers. That is what they did. That is how they operated. And when they decided to attack us like that as a terrorist organization, they basically signed their own destiny.
But Lieutenant Colonel, you say that you don't want to reoccupy the region. Could you be worried, though, that there is going to be a generation of Palestinian children in Gaza watching this happen if the ground assault does occur, whose views of Israel could be forever shaped by this?
So unfortunately, we know how Hamas is educating its children anyway. So that probably would not be the reason why the children of Gaza are suffering. I think that we all need to understand that decent people can't accept the butchering of women and children in their homes. Decent people can't accept the abduction of 88-year-old men and women.
Lieutenant Colonel, I appreciate that, and I'm sorry for interrupting, but also it's not just Hamas, of course, who is being hurt here. There are thousands of civilian casualties already.
Hamas is the governing authority of Gaza. It is the elected governing authority of Gaza. It's like one country going to war with another country. It is the reality of the situation on the ground. We can't ignore that. And we can't excuse the governing authority of the Gaza Strip because there are civilians. And I would add, you can't expect Israel not to protect its civilians because Hamas is hiding behind theirs. This is the reality forced upon us. I said, we did not want to go to war. I'd say our military intelligence failed in its assessment when it suggested that Hamas is not interested in a war with Israel. But obviously Hamas was interested in a war, a brutal war, that in one day alone, they butchered, murdered, and massacred over 1,400 people. When we look at these figures, the devastation, the unprecedented attack against Israeli society in the history of a country that has known war since its existence, we cannot accept that to be the new norm of terrorism.
Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. Have a good evening.